got the after lunch, you've digested your food slump slot, so that's exciting. It's also really uplifting when you're sitting there and after the last person has spoken, loads of people leave. So thank you for staying. So my first thank you is thanks for staying. My next thank you is thank you hopefully for staying awake. And the third is thank you hopefully for listening. So as Richard said, I'm going to talk to you today actually not about original neuroscience research because a media agency doesn't employ neuroscientists, funny enough. Well, some maybe aligned to that. But we're going to draw from some neuroscience research to talk about how our brains are being impacted by the digital era that we live in. I was always taught, use a snappy, intriguing title as part of your presentation. Hopefully it makes people stay because they want to hear what you've got to say. It went terribly wrong because this has been used in so many different ways now. James, I hope you don't mind me saying, it's been advertising for 4-year-olds, which is interesting. I was expecting to see a whole bunch of 4-year-olds here going, how do we do advertising? It's been also called advertising 4-year-olds. Which is a bit weird. I'm definitely not saying we should use 4-year-olds to sell them or to use them to sell our products. But no, this is about advertising to 4-year-olds because I believe that actually a lot of the impact that's been made on our brains is making us more childlike. So I'm going to start with this, and you will all be familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. Any presentation that I do with a digital audience, I like to start with this because it's a good reminder of the world that we live in digital marketing. The hype cycle is a roller coaster ride from innovation through to full mass adoption. And there's a consumer technology one, which you'll know, but there's also this marketing and advertising product one, which is how we as an industry are consuming the technologies. So most people at this point, if they work in the sales side of the industry, will be looking at where they are in the hype cycle. Am I at the innovation trigger? Am I at the peak of inflated expectations about to crash down into the trough of disillusionment? Or am I out now on the plateau of productivity? The reason I've shown it today is because, one, we have to remind ourselves this is the world we live in. You don't get to mass adoption of products without going through this sort of cycle, and it can be hard work. But also because when you look at this one from 2018, I'd say about 3/4 of this cycle is covering areas of data-led marketing, DMPs, CEPs, customer, all of the things that we're talking about now, which essentially have made us obsessed with this people-based marketing term in digital. And so today, hopefully I'm going to show you something a bit different that flips that, because I don't think we're understanding people any better than we ever did before. So let's explore that. We talk a lot about the impact that digital has had on us economically, how we shop, how we produce things, how we work. We talk about it socially, how we communicate, share, interact. We talk about it politically, for good or for bad, but we talk a lot less about how it's impacting us as individuals. So we have drawn on a lot of neuroscience research. If any of you are interested in this space, I would highly recommend a lady called Professor Susan Greenfield. She wrote a book called Mind Change. She's on a number of TED Talks, and it's fascinating to hear from her. She is a neuroscientist on how it's impacted our brains, for good or for bad. So I'm going to explore some of that today. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, this, of a much bigger piece of work that the strategy team have done at MG, but I'm going to cover off 5 ways digital's impacted our brains. If that's making us more childlike, can we learn from experts that know how to get the most out of children and influence children and children's behavior? And so I'm going to go through 5 of those and then leap from that to, could we apply those ways of influencing children to consumers in our marketing strategy? So first up, one way, just a small way that digital has impacted our brains. Apparently, according to some commentators, we are in an identity crisis. We don't know who we are, and that's caused in part from digital. There's a term that's been used for many years now called digiphrenia, which is that we are managing multiple identities, both online and in the physical space, and that's become a confusion, and we're not consolidating who we are as one single identity. And actually, as we know, a lot of younger audiences don't distinguish between online and offline at all. Asking a 20-year-old, how much time do you spend online, is like asking me, how much time do you spend with electricity? It's just a nonsense conversation. But actually, what is interesting is there are still differences in how they portray themselves in those different areas, physically, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Snap, wherever it is, there's slight micro-identities that are existing. And so this is enabling or actually pushing this idea that there's identity crisis happening as people are developing their identities. Equally, we'd like to think that we live in a world where we're all incredibly individual in our tastes and characteristics, but actually we're hyper-connected now that it means that we've got so much greater influence by the crowd, we're probably a lot less individual than we ever thought we were. So the first thing that's impacted is identity as a whole. The second, which is the one that I find most interesting actually, is empathy. I'm sorry to say that a lot of different research says that empathy is on the decline. It has been for about 30 years, and that's accelerated in the last 10. And there are two sides to empathy and how we develop it. The first is individual empathy, and that's driven by communication and how we develop communication. It's body language, eye contact, it's voice, it's pheromones. That's how we develop individual empathy. So it's quite clear that when there's a digital screen between you and another person, your ability to develop that diminishes. The second form of empathy that we develop is that of empathy for a group. And that's a much harder thing because actually that relies on something that we call empathy bias. So I conform to your ideas and your values, and therefore I can empathize with you easier. I reject your ideas and your values. It's harder for me to empathize with you. And quite clearly we are seeing that play out now in social and political areas because the echo chambers that exist, either through algorithms or our own choice in digital spaces, are influencing this. So empathy is the second. The third is attention. So I love this idea of the attention paradox. On one hand, attention doesn't exist for us anymore. We're jumping from one thing to another. We have no attention for anything in depth, but we'll jump across things a lot. So there's this idea that we don't have as much attention. We talk about attention scarcity. On the flip of that, my God, do we want attention? Look at me, here I am, doing something you really don't care about, but I'm sharing it to you because I want you to know that I'm here. I'm still here, hi, I'm still here, I exist. So there's this attention paradox where we're really needy, but we don't want to give attention in return. We don't have time for it. So I've talked about a couple of things where there's a decline, albeit there's that increase in the need for attention. The one where there is an increase is in our use of icons and visual consumption that's going on. And it's interesting, obviously, from the history of communication, we started out with hieroglyphics. We now have emojis and emoticons. We've moved completely full circle. But again, when we've got very little attention, consuming things visually is a much quicker way of us doing things and is our preference now. So we are increasing in the amount that we want to consume visual information. And the other piece of good news is that we are processing information as humans much faster than ever before. It's at our disposal, we know it's there, we're becoming more curious as a result because we know we can access it, and we are able to process a light, shallow level of information much faster. There is a slight flip to this because some argue that actually as a result of digital technologies, we are also losing the ability to remember. Our memories are declining because we're not training them. We don't need to remember. Everything is there for us to access. So actually, whilst it's really positive that we can process things quicker and multitask and all these other things, actually, are we losing the art of memory because we're not learning things by rote as much? So you can see actually when we pull these together that there is an argument that says losing and not developing identity, empathy on the wane, this paradox of we've got less attention to give you, but God, do we want it back? And then icons being really important, visual consumption, and finally, ability to process loads of stuff around us. You could argue we are becoming a bit more childlike. And if only I had a manifestation of all of those things in one individual to show you, but unfortunately I couldn't find one. So here's a picture of Trump as a baby. So what I'm now going to go through is actually, can we draw from the way that people influence children and the experts in that and apply that to our marketing if we're trying to influence consumers' brains? The first principle, and by the way, if there's any parents out there, this is, you get buy one, get one free, as I think James called it. There's some parenting tips in here as well. I don't know if they're actually effective. I've tried them. They're not working for me. But the first principle is to introduce yourself into a child's world. You cannot force yourself into that world, nor can you drag them into yours. Children build up a world of familiarity around them. That familiarity is built by their imagination. You have to understand that in order to become part of it. Don't force yourself, don't drag them. And you can see how that might apply to marketing. So this is an example of Starbucks, one of our clients, and they have been very effective for over a decade in social media marketing. But they wanted to become part of their consumers' worlds, knowing that actually more and more, as advertisers are getting better in this space, consumers are rejecting that. So what better way to do that than look at the behaviours of the audience, and the most prominent behaviour that was taking place was that wonderfully unhealthy mirror selfie. Now, I'm not going to ask you to put up your hands, but I'm sure some of you do it. What better way to get involved in their world in this trend of mirror selfies than to create Starbucks phone cases? So rather than advertising on the mobile became the advertising. So we sold phone cases with a partnership with Skinny Dip through Topshop, ASOS, Selfridges, and we got people to pay us to advertise us, which is really interesting, becoming part of their world. Every mirror selfie that was taken with the mobile phone case on the outside, that was shared organically, there's an interesting one, with Starbucks branding in it. So a really fascinating way. The phone cases paid back the marketing spend through the profit that was made, and there were 70 million impressions driven through this campaign. So becoming part of their world. And I would say the implication for that is we have a lot of data at our fingertips in digital, but make sure you're analysing the trends and the behaviours, not just the actions. The next principle, which is my favourite, because I'm really guilty of this, is you can't shout at someone when you're telling them to be quiet. A child is really confused by that. You have to role model what it is you're telling them. So whatever you're saying, make sure you're mirroring that with how you're saying it. And body language in comms is nothing new. Jeremy Balmer's been talking about it for years. But it is important to think about not just the message that you're saying to consumers in advertising, but how you choose to communicate that through the media choices and through the creative that you use. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So if I'm advertising a big blockbuster movie, or certainly I want you to perceive it as a big blockbuster movie, I could be really efficient with my spend. I could target the right people with the right message at the right time in a very efficient way. Or I could treat it like a big blockbuster movie and make you believe that everybody is going to watch that because it's huge. So that you can see how actually it's not just what I'm telling people, but how I'm telling them that might influence their perception of it. On the flip of that, if you've been telling people for some time, like John Lewis have, that your partners are your most important thing, then when it comes to your big blockbuster, your big Christmas campaign, in this case, hashtag Elton John Lewis, what better way to market it, not by going big and impactful as you usually would, but by using 5,000 of your partners to share it through their social media first and to release that exclusive content that everyone wanted to see. Whether those partners had one follower who was their best mate, or whether they had thousands of followers, they got to do it first. And that demonstration and that behaviour in comms aligns with the message that they've been telling people. So the second implication is align your body language to your message. The third principle we can take from child psychologists is about mastering emotions and really understanding and getting into the emotions of children. If any of you have children that have thrown a tantrum, you'll know that it's bloody hard to get them out of that space. And the last thing you want to do is go against them and keep pushing them when they're there, because they just won't do it. But do you know what? Nobody wants to be in that space. A child doesn't. None of us want to be grumpy forever. So actually, how can you break them out of it? And then how will they thank you for it? By giving you their attention. Well, there are ways. Distract them. Divert them to something else. Best of all, make them laugh. So if you make them giggle, they break out of the tantrum, then you can tell them off. But actually break them out of it and make them laugh, and they will thank you with their attention. Now, mood is nothing new in marketing. We've been using mood signals for a while, but I haven't seen that many examples of how we've tapped into mood in a really interesting way. This is a case study from from Battersea Dogs and Cats Homes, another one of our clients, where actually there's a lot of comms around BDCH, around the devastating effect, obviously, that's happening with the cats and dogs, and our want for people to rehouse them, rehome them. But everyone knows that a cat or a dog video is really uplifting if you like cats or dogs. It will make you smile in the grumpiest of moods. So the team took a load of data points and combined them to check when people were at their grumpiest, and then served them some really uplifting cats and dogs videos. And in return, were thanked with the attention for pulling them out of that space. So whether it be, we knew that people were delayed on their commuting route. It was forecasted to be a sunny day and then it was showering, or it was the day before payday when nobody's got any money. Using those data points to pick up on moods and mindsets and then to market within them. So mood is an interesting data point. I think it's underused, and think about how it can play an important part in marketing. The fourth one is a simple one. Kids love visuals. Show them is better than tell them. Images play a huge part in their world. And we know this ourselves. In fact, interesting to see Tim's presentation and how the visual search clearly is not working on ASOS at the moment for white shirts. But visual search is becoming more an important part of how we consume content and how we navigate choice in content as well. Now, there are loads of examples of this, of how retailers have used visual search to navigate products. The next example I'm going to show you I love because it's not an obvious one, but actually it's a really good one, and that's for EasyJet. So this is called Look and Book. They took the insight that obviously on social media there is an awful lot of imagery around beautiful destinations. It's some of the nicest imagery you can see. And even when people are sharing shots from their holidays, it's lovely imagery. What they have done is create an app where you can then look at that imagery. It will scan it, tell you where it is, and then also tell you the nearest airport to that place and how much it would cost you to get there, which I just think is really interesting because it's taking inspiration through to information in a really quick way, using visual as the driver. So the implication there is visual search is nothing new, and it will become more important, but think about how you can design for it in your comms outside of the normal. The fifth principle with children, again, is an obvious one, but repetition, repetition, repetition. I talked earlier about our memory perhaps being diminished slightly, or our capability, but repetition is key to that, learning by rote. And this is the important point. You can't be inconsistent with a child, because not only will it confuse them, it will frustrate them. So if a teacher's telling them one thing, a childminder is telling them another, and a parent is telling them something else, which one do they go with? That's terrible repetition. And we could say the same of brands, and we are all guilty of this. We talk about consumer and customer journey mapping, but the silos that still exist around this, and the different multitude of messages that we're serving to consumers because we can, perhaps is meaning that we're saying a lot of things without saying anything actually at all. Equally, over time, we are addicted to reinvention. We live in digital in a test and learn world, and we're always looking for new ways of doing things. But do you know what? Consistency over time is not a bad thing. That drives familiarity. It's repetition, repetition, repetition. So in the drive for reinvention, maybe just think about how to adapt with some consistency, not completely change every time. So my two thoughts on that are, one, don't over-fragment your comms. You'll say a lot without saying anything at all. Break down those silos, be consistent. And two, consider repetition over reinvention from a longevity point of view. So I've talked to you about a lot of things. And as I say, this is a much bigger piece of work. But in my summary, I've got the 5 areas that I think are big, impactful things that technology is playing a role, not the only part of, but a role in changing how we think and how we behave as humans. 5 areas that we can take cues from child psychologists on how we should manage and influence children. And then 5 ways actually, because what we're talking about is influencing humans, you can apply that to your marketing tactics. So I hope that's been different. I hope it's been interesting. I think you've all stayed awake. And finally, because it would be remiss of me not to, this was a completely indulgent piece of work because when we did it, my son was 4 and I just wanted to know how to deal with him. So as a final thank you, this is Harrison. Thank you all for staying awake. Thank you.